Not long ago, I specifically prepared an entire episode dedicated to how Moscow creates gray zones and how it uses them afterwards. I examined in detail the very technology and the step-by-step process of creating such unrecognized states as thoroughly as possible and relying solely on facts. However, in the comments, many users started asking questions about what the current situation is in these very gray zones, how people live there, and what their livelihoods are. Is there any chance for survival at all? And what is the kind Tsar father doing to support the poor and unfortunate serfs? Therefore, today's video will be dedicated exclusively to the current state of affairs in the unrecognized republics. The focus will be on the peculiarities of political and socio-economic life in these black holes of humanity. I will devote a separate section to whether they currently pose a threat to Ukraine. And yes, I will deliberately not be discussing Donbas, because at the moment it is not a gray zone, but rather a zone colored by blood, an unprecedented amount of blood. So many lost human lives. For now, you have more than enough with Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. My name is Semyon. Welcome to Mega Show Television. Get comfortable and let's start. International legal status. I'll start from a bit further back. We will look at what these gray zones represent today in terms of international status. That is, how other countries, as well as major international organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, perceive Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. We traditionally call them unrecognized states, and that's absolutely true, but there's one small nuance. After the war in South Ossetia in 2008, when Russian tanks almost invaded Tbilisi, Russia made a rather unconventional move. It recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states and established diplomatic relations with them. And later, 4 more countries did the same. Just please don't laugh. Nicaragua and Nauru, which most viewers would hardly find on a map. Venezuela, which was ruled by the anti-American Hugo Chavez, and Syria, which was ruled by our old acquaintance Bashar Assad. And that's it. Even the loyal Lukashenko stayed noticeably silent. He probably thought it wasn't worth getting involved in this pointless mess. By the way, Belarus still hasn't recognized the annexation of Crimea and the 4 Ukrainian regions, at least officially. But Transnistria had it much worse. Caught between Moldova and Ukraine, no one recognized it, not even symbolically, except Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That's not surprising. As the saying goes, tell me your friend and I'll tell you who you are. International organizations like the United Nations, G7 NATO, and the European Union do not recognize these gray zones as sovereign states. They only support Georgia and Moldova's territorial integrity. So they can't really count on international financial aid or any other kind of support. They can only rely on the goodwill of the Orthodox Tsar, who isn't exactly in a hurry to spend money. The degree of Russia's influence. At first glance, this seems like a trivial question. However, in reality, the answer to it determines the specifics of the domestic policy of each unrecognized state. And although all 3 of these gray zones have long since become puppets of Moscow, the degree to which they are controlled still varies. Putin's control is felt most strongly in the Caucasus, and this is primarily due to the presence of a shared border with Russia. That is why both Abkhazia and South Ossetia, in essence, serve as footholds for exerting control over Georgia and as potential factors for destabilizing the entire Caucasus region. It's like a postponed war, the likelihood of which is very high. Moscow actually likes things like that. After all, Mother Russia gains her power not through peaceful development, but by starting wars and spreading chaos and destruction. Alas, that's her nature. You can't turn a monster into a pet, no matter how much we wish otherwise. Anyway, let's get back to the point. Russian control over South Ossetia has especially intensified since 2022. This is explained by its convenient geographical location due to the mountainous terrain and the specific placement of the passes. South Ossetia has effectively turned into a major logistical route for delivering sanctioned goods to Russia. It's no secret anymore that Turkey, Georgia, and partly Armenia are key intermediaries in transporting banned Western chips, semiconductors, and other dual-use goods that can be used by the Russian defense industry, and they make good money from it. The truth is, all this grey export ends up being built into Kalibr and Iskander missiles, which Moscow so loves to use to pound Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. But really, what's there to be surprised about? For some, war is a disaster, for others, it's a gold mine. It's always been that way. Russia also seriously controls Abkhazia. However, lately there has been a certain weakening of Moscow's position, which actually indicates a gradual loss of influence in the Caucasus as a whole. We are talking about the political crisis and the subsequent mass protests in November 2024. The fact is that the leadership of the self-proclaimed state decided to allow Russian oligarchs into the Abkhazian market at the expense of the interests of the local elite. Not for free, of course. Officially, this was presented as granting a number of benefits to major Russian investors, and above all, it was planned to transfer large plots of land into the ownership of Russian companies. If these laws were adopted, the Abkhaz clans would lose their monopoly on income from tourism. They organized mass protests, which forced the so-called president and prime minister of Abkhazia, who had become too greedy, to resign. And most notably, Moscow, which was interested in keeping its puppets in power, responded harshly but without any real prospects. Putin, of course, didn't dare to use military force so as not to open a new front in the Caucasus, but for a while he shut off the tap to his own grey zone by suspending funding for Abkhazian public sector workers and pensioners. However, even this pressure did not make them back down. The Abkhazians still held their ground. A couple of months later, with a heavy heart, the Kremlin was forced to come to terms with the new state of affairs and establish contact with the new authorities. All this shows that, if necessary, the Abkhaz elites are ready to defend their positions and even, to some extent, stand up to Moscow, and that's already a warning sign.
There will be more to come.
But where Moscow's influence is quite limited is the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic, which, by the way, recently celebrated its 35th anniversary with great pomp. And again, this is due to the geographical location of this grey zone. It doesn't share a border with Russia and is more like an enclave, an island, similar to the Kaliningrad region, but on a much smaller scale, and Ukraine serves as a sort of Suwalki corridor. Well, it's not the best comparison, of course, but that's how the Kremlin sees it. Without capturing the northern Black Sea region, Russia simply won't be able to establish full control over Transnistria and the Black Sea as a whole, and the local corrupt mafia elites will inevitably start looking around toward Moldova, Ukraine, and even Romania. After all, business is business and ideology can wait. What about democracy there? Democracy and a grey zone, that's already a joke. It's like trying to fit the impossible into the impossible. Human rights, civil society, political competition, and free elections. All of these are nothing more than phantoms for these unrecognized pseudo-states practically from the very first days of their existence. And even when there were at least some beginnings of democracy in the Russian Federation itself, during the time of Borisky Yeltsin, in its satellites, the real laws of the jungle essentially prevailed. As the saying goes, your own hand is your ruler. For example, Transnistria. For 20 years, from 1991 to 2011, the so-called president was Igor Smirnov, who in fact started all this mess with the separation from Moldova and the creation of his own state. Apparently, he believed in the generous perks from Moscow and ruled against the very constitution he adopted, which limited his powers to 2 terms. They say if you truly want something, you can do it, even if you shouldn't. And Smirnov reset his presidential terms in an instant, just like the bold Kremlin dwarf using a fake referendum. The master of the Transnistrian lands could have ruled longer if Moscow hadn't politely asked him to step down and replaced him with the younger, more loyal Yevgeny Shevchuk, who soon became extremely corrupt, even by the standards of a deeply corrupt grey zone. Or maybe he dipped into the thieves' common fund, skimmed a little, and in 2017 was forced to flee headlong to Moldova, where he still resides to this day. And we shouldn't forget that, in all these quasi-states, the local security services have enormous power. The State Security Service of Abkhazia, the State Security Committee of South Ossetia, and the Ministry of State Security of Transnistria. All of them were formed on the basis of local branches of the State Security Committee, and therefore they are, in a way, branches of the modern Federal Security Service. Plus, in addition to the local ones, the gray zones are literally packed with agents from Russia itself. These KGB officers, besides controlling the situation in the gray zones, are actively engaged in destabilizing the situation in Moldova and Georgia themselves. The recent elections in these two countries are a vivid example of this, with the difference being that Moldova demonstrated its commitment to a pro-European course, while Georgia became even more mired in the Russian swamp. How do we make a living? This is my favorite topic. It's always important to know how and what an economy of a particular country runs on, to know what its people do, and of course to know what the standard of living is. After all, at one time, separatist forces in Transnistria, South Ossetia and Abkhazia actively claimed that by breaking away they would live much better lives. Almost like rivers of milk with jelly banks. But in reality, things were quite harsh. Poverty, depression and hopelessness, that's what any unrecognized state is synonymous with. The best outcome was in Abkhazia, and that's only because of the resort factor. Access to the Black Sea, a warm subtropical climate, and the Soviet-era tourist infrastructure that was inherited allow them to at least stay afloat a little. Plus, there is regular financial aid from Russia, most of which traditionally ends up in the pockets of the local establishment. And ordinary Abkhazians are left to just survive, scraping by from one resort season to the next. They earn a bit by growing and selling fruit, such as Abkhazian mandarins and grapes found in many southern Russian city markets. Attempts to revive tea cultivation popular in the Soviet era have completely failed. After all, cultivating this heat-loving plant requires significant investments, which no one is making in Abkhazia, not even the big Russian brother. However, even these advantages have many drawbacks in practice. The once hugely popular Soviet resorts of Pitsunda, Gagra and Sukhumi are now barely half full. Even during the hottest season, you can easily find empty beaches here. And it's all because of the mismatch between price and quality, poor infrastructure, and low level of service. Almost all vacationers in Abkhazia note the poor service in hotels, cafes, and other tourist spots. Power outages and, as a result, water supply interruptions, especially in private sectors and small villages. The sewage system is extremely worn out, which leads to discharges into the sea and an increase in cases of intestinal infections at the peak of the season. Many hotel facilities still suffer from poor conditions inherited from the Soviet era. In general, many tourists are discouraged by the overall condition of Abkhazian cities and towns. Abandoned buildings, dilapidated facades, and the consequences of a war that still haven't been addressed are often seen. And you don't even have to look for petty theft, robberies and scams. They'll find their own victims. So the only people who might want to vacation in Abkhazia are folks from remote Russian provinces who can't afford Turkey, Sochi or even the occupied Crimea. However, for the average resident of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky or Uryupinsk, this kind of vacation is just what they need. The situation in South Ossetia is even worse, since it has no access to the sea and can't even theoretically become a center of tourism. Its economy is almost entirely dependent on Russian subsidies. In different years, the share of Russian injections into the budget of this unrecognized state ranged from 80 to 90%. Agriculture is mostly subsistence and small scale. In the valleys, they grow potatoes and vegetables and raise sheep and goats. Industry in South Ossetia is almost non-existent. The few Soviet-era enterprises have long since been dismantled brick by brick or simply no longer operate. Due to the high level of corruption among local authorities, opportunities for private business are extremely limited, so almost all of the working population is employed in the public sector. For example, public sector employees and law enforcement officers. However, the payment of their salaries and pensions directly depends on the amount of handouts from Putin. Against this backdrop, Transnistria is notable for smuggling. Locals mainly survive by smuggling goods from Ukraine to Moldova and other European countries. And vice versa, it is not uncommon for the well-known Preluki cigarettes to be repackaged and then sold on the black market in Chisinau, Bucharest and other European cities. In the European Union, high excise taxes make local tobacco products very expensive. The scheme also works in the opposite direction. For example, Moldovan brandy and wine make their way to the shelves of Ukrainian stores through Transnistria, but with a significant markup. These schemes aren't possible without protection at Moldovan and Ukrainian customs. That's why Transnistria is often called Europe's black hole, a place where things vanish and reappear in a different form. Unfortunately, for decades, Moldova and Ukraine turned a blind eye to the Transnistrian problem, and many people in power made good money from these smuggling and corruption schemes. After Russia's 2022 invasion, Ukrainian authorities closed all checkpoints to unrecognized Transnistria for security reasons, so that all sorts of people, like Gerkin Strelkov, wouldn't slip through from there. This step significantly reduced the volume of smuggling, bringing it down to a minimum. The second factor that allowed the economy of Transnistria to stay afloat for a long time was very cheap Russian gas, which was supplied in transit through Ukrainian territory. For Transnistrian enterprises, it was 3 to 4 times cheaper than on the domestic Russian market, and for the population, it was practically free. Such unprecedented communism was explained by Moscow's desire to maintain the loyalty of Transnistria's residents, as well as to allow local industrial products to retain at least some competitiveness. After all, Transnistria inherited many industrial enterprises from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but very quickly everything went downhill. Of the former Moldovan Donbass, only a few actually operating enterprises remain, the most important of which are the Moldovan Metallurgical Plant in Ribnica, the Bender Electromechanical Plant, and the thermal power station in the city of Dnestrovsk. All of them managed to survive thanks to free gas, otherwise the cost of the products they produced would have been incomparably high. And even so, hardly anyone buys their products except for Moldova. Neither Ukraine, nor Russia, nor especially the European Union needs these products at all. They have plenty of their own metal and electricity. So a very reasonable question arises. If Moldova remained the main trading partner, then why was it necessary to separate from it? As they say, it's a tricky question. No matter how long the thread twists, the free gas is already gone. On the morning of January 1st, 2025, Ukraine completely shut off the transit of Russian gas through its territory. For several months, Transnistria was gripped by economic collapse and a real humanitarian catastrophe. And all this happened because its corrupt and very short-sighted authorities relied for too long on the generosity of the bold dwarf and never even considered diversifying their energy sources for a moment. Especially when a full-scale war had been raging in Ukraine for 3 years. However, by spring the situation had somewhat stabilized. To resume supplies, a new semi-corrupt mechanism was developed under which Transnistria had to switch to gas supplies from the European direction. Imports came from Romania through Moldova, and the financing of these gas purchases for Transnistria was handled by the intermediary company JNX, General Trading Limited Liability Company, registered in the United Arab Emirates, whose ultimate beneficiary, according to rumors, is the Russian company Gazprom. And this is despite the fact that the leadership of the European Union, even though they do not recognize Transnistria, offered 60 million euros in aid for purchasing gas on the European market. But no, the proud authorities of Transnistria refused European handouts, yet they agreed to accept Russian ones. That's the double standard of Putin's puppets. Thus, the economies of all these gray zones are in no way self-sufficient. Neither the separatist authorities nor the benevolent Russian autocrat managed to build any paradise on earth. And they didn't even really try. Moreover, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they don't even have their own currency, only Russian rubles. In turn, the Transnistrian ruble can only be used as a substitute for toilet paper outside of Transnistria itself. That's the reality of life in unrecognized states. Social issues, demographics, etc. The fragility of the economies of these pseudo-states and their serious dependence on the mercy of the Tsar father lead to huge problems in the social sphere and, first and foremost, to demographic problems. People are fleeing from the gray zones. The lack of any positive prospects in the foreseeable future forces many local residents, and of course, first and foremost the youth, to seek happiness in another calmer and more stable place. For example, at the dawn of its existence, the population of the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic was just over 700,000 people, but over the next 35 years, it almost halved and now stands at about 450,000. A similar situation exists in Abkhazia, where the population dropped from 525,000 in 1991 to under 250,000 today. In South Ossetia, it fell from nearly 100,000 to 56,000. Also, remember that official statistics count all registered residents, even those who left the gray zones long ago seeking stability and a better life. So the real number of residents is even lower. In addition, in all these cases, there is a creeping and steady aging of the population due to low birth rates and the mass departure of young people of working age. The light version of emigration is widespread labor migration. Shuttle and seasonal emigration is often the main source of income for people from Transnistria, Abkhazia, and Ossetia. The latter often work in southern Russia, including Krasnodar, Sochi, Tuapse, Vladikavkaz, Stavropol, and Rostov-on-Don. Abkhazian and Ossetian seasonal workers mainly work in construction, hotels, the service sector, and retail. The lucky ones reach Moscow and St. Petersburg, but it's different for Transnistria residents. Here, the main destinations for migrant work are the territory of Moldova itself, as well as the border regions in Ukraine. Before Russia's full-scale invasion, estimates show 30,000 to 70,000 Transnistria residents worked annually in the Odessa region. But since 2022, the migration landscape has changed dramatically. The close borders with Ukraine and the extremely unsafe situation have made the western Moldovan direction dominant. And after Romania joined the Schengen zone, many people sought to obtain Romanian passports, which allow them to live and work freely in almost all European Union countries. And a couple more words about passports. For Abkhazians and Ossetians, having a Russian passport means having the opportunity to go somewhere, while for people from Transnistria it's necessary to have Moldovan and Ukrainian passports. And it's not only professional migrant workers who take advantage of this, but also members of the well-off local elite who have been benefiting from corruption and smuggling schemes for many years, as well as successfully making use of the crumbs sent from Moscow. Absolutely all so-called presidents of Transnistria had booklets with the double-headed eagle, and the current one, Vadim Krasnoselsky, even has one with the trident. In addition to Ukrainian citizenship, he also owns elite real estate in the Primorsky district of Odessa, and the exact address can even be found on the Myra Tvorets website. So, pro-Russian ideology doesn't interfere at all with doing business, even with the so-called damned Ukro-Banderites. To clear up any doubts about life in gray zones, I'll share some specific numbers which don't lie. Even taking into account the significant amount of Russian subsidies and the relatively small number of local residents, the gross domestic product per capita is simply laughable. As of 2024 in Abkhazia, it does not exceed $4,000, and in South Ossetia, $3,200. Despite this, the number in Georgian-controlled territory is 8,900 in Transnistria, just 2,300, and in Moldova itself, 7,400. Even in war-torn Ukraine, where much of the economy is ruined, the gross domestic product per capita is $5,600. In Romania, the European Union's poorest country, it's nearly 19,000 bucks. That's it. Checkmate. The final nail in the coffin of the Russian world. A danger for Ukraine. And finally, I'll touch on a topic that might interest our viewers the most. How dangerous are these Kremlin puppets for Ukraine? Do they pose any real threat in the context of the current Russian-Ukrainian war? South Ossetia and Abkhazia can be crossed out right away. There has been no direct and official involvement of their armed formations in combat operations on the territory of Ukraine. However, mercenaries among the Abkhazians and Ossetians are fighting. This is indeed a fact, and it's not surprising, since Russian recruiters regularly operate in gray zones in search of the necessary manpower. However, even there, few were willing to fight for a large sum. Estimates put the number of local thugs at several hundred to several thousand. So Abkhazia and South Ossetia pose no more of a threat than any other depressed Russian region. It's a completely different story with Transnistria, since it's right next to Ukraine in close proximity to the strategically important Odessa and other seaports. 450 kilometers of shared border with the Russian enclave is, by definition, a high-risk zone, especially since the Russian 14th Army is still stationed here, which Moscow conveniently forgot to withdraw right after the war in 1992. However, it's probably called an army only on paper. Today, the total number of Russian troops in Transnistria is just over 1,500 people, and most of them aren't actually Russians, but locals who have received Russian passports. After all, serving in the Russian army is still one of the few reliable and stable sources of income for many men in the gray zone. At the same time, there are very few career military personnel from Russia itself, so the combat readiness of these soldiers is unlikely to be rated highly. Plus, there are the armed forces of Transnistria itself, which number about 5,000 to 6,000 people, but their combat readiness is even worse. The local population may worship the Moscow Tsar, but they don't really want to fight for him. In any case, the idea of mobilization doesn't resonate even with the most hardcore fans of Mother Russia. The military equipment is outdated and hasn't been modernized since the 1960s or 1970s. There are about 20 T-64 tanks, 50 armored personnel carriers, and a few GRAD artillery systems. But it's impossible to say how many of them are actually operational. Unless you check, you won't know. Therefore, at the moment, the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic does not pose a real military threat to Ukraine, but rather serves as a sort of time bomb and a tool for Russia's hybrid influence on both Ukraine and Moldova at the same time. Transnistria's military is very limited, outdated, and isolated. As of today, the real danger lies only in potential scenarios where Russia could use this territory to escalate tensions and create additional problems for Ukraine in order to weaken its main defensive efforts, especially since there are plenty of Russian agents in Transnistria. The situation can only change in one case: if Russian troops somehow cross the Dnipro and start advancing along the sea toward Odessa. Then indeed there is a chance of a new front opening from Transnistria, but not for a real offensive, only to distract Ukrainian troops from other directions. This was exactly what the Kremlin strategists wanted in the first week of the invasion. However, the heroic defense of Mykolaiv and the failure of the landing operation in Odessa put an end to their plans. For now, Transnistria is nothing more than an old suitcase without a handle, and the other gray zones aren't much better. That's what the Russian world looks like in all its glory. Thank you to all the viewers for watching and to all the channel sponsors for their financial support. Goodbye, everyone.